Hello, class. This is a lecture on altered states of consciousness to accompany the slides that we have with chapter 5 from Stein and Stein's Anthropology of Magic, Witchcraft, and Religion. So settle back and don't get yourself in too much of an altered state so you can pay attention. Behind me, I have a redwood tree to kind of set a scene of being a little bit of in nature, because it is important, what is called setting, for those who are going to encounter an altered state of consciousness. But I also want to point out one other factor as we go along. We'll see that not everything we associate with an altered state of consciousness is used this way. So, for instance, if I hold up my coffee cup here, and you can't really see it unless I got to take away the virtual background for a moment. There. This vessel was used for ritualistic purposes. So I am drinking coffee. Coffee can be used for ritual. Usually we think of tea, but it can also, both of those can achieve a slight altered state of consciousness. Is there a normal state of consciousness, however? What do we consider normal? Is our body always in the same state? Is our mind always in the same state of consciousness? Even in our daily lives, we can kind of question that. And related to that, what do we mean by altered? If I have a cup of coffee, or going to the bottom left quadrant, if I have a good meal, if I have a great discussion, if I'm in a particular relationship, all of these can alter our consciousness. So in this discussion, we're going to limit ourselves to, first, practices and substances that may significantly alter our conscious state relating to the sacred or supernatural. So key here is the term significantly and sacred and supernatural. Second bullet, for comparison, practices and substances used in ritual that do not significantly alter our conscious state physically, although perhaps psychologically. So we're looking at taking substances, doing practices, but also doing rituals. Not all altered states of consciousness involve drugs. For example, fasting. I'll get back to fasting in a moment, but also let me mention some other things that might bring in an altered state of consciousness. Chanting. In the right-hand picture, you see a ghost dancer. This is a photograph from 1890. And this ghost dancer, who is Lakota Sioux, is chanting a song based on a vision he received while doing the ghost dance. So chanting can bring about an altered state of consciousness. Dancing. So before this person was chanting, everybody, as you see the people sitting on the ground to his right, they were all dancing. And so dancing can bring on an altered state of consciousness. Pain can bring on an altered state of consciousness. In my live class, somebody brought up there are a few practices that involve pain. For example, wearing a crown of thorns in Christianity, or wearing a barbed what is called a cyclus around the thigh, which was made famous in the Da Vinci Code. Or self-flagellation, as might be practiced by Shiite Muslims. So in this case, pain is seen as a way of identifying with the difficulties, with the pain and the sacrifice that was involved amongst religious actors back in the day. And of course, two other practices that might achieve an altered state of consciousness is meditation. So Buddhist monks try to achieve a state where they're not thinking, a state of no mind under meditation. And this will be an altered state of consciousness. If you've ever tried to not think, you know how difficult that might be, because constantly what comes into your head is the thought to not think, which means you're thinking. So eliminating that can bring about an altered state of consciousness, but it takes great discipline. And then finally, prayer. Prayer can bring out an altered state of consciousness. Prayer is about projecting forward your intention, what you want, and that can create a psychological state in front of the divine that the prayer is believed to be praying towards, and establishing a sacred relationship, and that can bring out an altered state of consciousness. But back to fasting. We have three traditions that are related: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And all of them have a fasting practice. I also want to bring up the fact very briefly, although it's not entirely part of this particular presentation, that in each one of the fasting practices I'm about to mention, there's a feast involved. So I like to conceive of fasting, the fasting altered state of consciousness, really as a pair, the fasting feasting pairing, so that one goes into a state of great denial, and then one eventually goes, after this altered state of consciousness, one rewards that sacrifice with something that is pleasurable, something that gives a positive side to the sacred. So that in Yom Kippur, in Judaism, Jews seek to forgive their sins from the previous year by fasting for 24 hours, no food and no water. And at the end of that fast, they break the fast with a nice meal. In Islam, Ramadan goes for a month, and Muslims fast from sunup to sundown. Each end of fast, each day is broken by a special meal, a modest meal, but a special meal, sometimes of holiday foods. And at the end of Ramadan, there is a feast, the Eid, in which Muslims can come out of this fasting period and come back into the normal everyday of eating good food. And then finally, Christians, at least some Christians, celebrate Lent, a 40-day period, which doesn't involve fasting to the extent that it does in Judaism or Islam, but involves giving up something that is dear, something that is important to the person for 40 days in order to focus on, again, that notion of sacrifice. And then, like the other traditions, the Lent period is ended with a meal, the Easter dinner in many traditions. So these practices, fasting produces an altered state of consciousness, but it is paired with a feast as well. Besides these non-substance or means of achieving an altered state of consciousness without a substance, we have the use of drugs. Now, before you get too excited, we have to look at 3 different uses of drugs. One is really just part of the modern world. In anthropology, we like to study cultures that are involved in the pre-modern world. And so there's a little difference there. So first of all, first and foremost, the way drugs are used are for healing, medicinal use. Drugs that are used for an altered state of consciousness sometimes have a medicinal use, or sometimes they have a nutritional value. So, for example, coca, used in the high Andes, which is a leaf that is chewed, which can be manufactured to make cocaine, but that's not what indigenous people are using. They get the benefit, besides an altered state of consciousness, of some vitamins that the coca leaf has, vitamin A, vitamin C, but also it equalizes their blood pressure for life in the high Andes, which without that can be quite unpleasant if you've ever been at a very high elevation. So the coca leaf acts as a drug, it acts as something nutritional, and it produces an altered state of consciousness. Secondly, we have recreational use. Now, this is something that really is about the modern world. This is about societies where work and leisure are differentiated, so that when people leave work, they want to unwind, or they want to drop out of the everyday life and just get high, or get drunk or something like that. Now, in indigenous cultures, there is not such a fine distinction between work and leisure. So you can't really speak of recreational use without that distinction. Sure, there are pleasurable aspects to drugs according to indigenous peoples as well, but that's not the main reason why they take these substances. And then the third use of drugs amongst humans is for religious use, in order to acknowledge, to ritualize, or to experience the sacred. And that will be the rest of what we talk about from here on. So as I kind of indicated at the beginning with my coffee cup, drugs used for religious purposes might be used to accompany a ritual. For example, a tea ceremony. So Japanese culture is famous for their tea ceremony, for example. And the tea ceremony has its root in Zen Buddhism. And Zen has an aesthetic that involves what today, a big buzzword you might hear, is mindfulness. So every action, every movement in this tea ceremony is done slowly, deliberately, with mindfulness. Okay. So it has not really as much to do with the effect of the tea as the effect of the overall ritual in this particular case. And then my second example is offering alcohol to the gods. So in Norse culture, the Vikings were famous for this. And so if they were drinking beer or mead, they might pour some out on the ground to Odin in praise of Odin. And so in this particular case, they are sacrificing the effect of the alcohol to ritualistically offer it to the god. So contrary to achieving an altered state of consciousness through ingesting alcohol, they are achieving an altered state of consciousness by denying themselves alcohol and giving it in or offering it to the gods. And as a side note, modern day gangs sometimes have an activity like this, where they pour out some beer or alcohol on the ground in honor of the homies that might have passed. So it's not just a matter of ancient Norse society, but this kind of practice exists today, even though perhaps not in this case in a religious context. And then, of course, another religious purpose of taking drugs might be an altered state of consciousness. So we have an example, the fly agaric mushroom that's ingested by Siberian shamans to contact the spirit world. And we will get to that in a moment. As an example, a further example of how drugs are used ritualistically and not ingested to get the effects, we move to South America, to Bolivia. And to the right of the slide, you will see a picture that is taken within a mine shaft, a tin mine. I'm sorry, a copper mine. Tin comes from copper and bronze together. So you'll have this statue, and to the left you see a miner there who is giving an offering to the statue. And so that statue is Wari, the Aymara god of the deep earth, who guards the entrance to the mines. There's another deity, a female deity called the Pachamama, who is the guardian of the surface of the earth. She is your classic earth mother. But Wari is not the same. The Pachamama is pretty nice and benevolent. Wari can get pretty mean. Now, the Aymara don't conceive him as absolutely evil, like the devil, but perhaps some of those elements have crept in. As a matter of fact, Wari is referred to by the miners as El Tío, often, which means uncle, and that's often a euphemism also for the devil. And they say it, they call him El Tío for fear that if they say his name, if they invoke him, they will invite disaster. And whenever I hear that, I think of the movie Beetlejuice, where if you say that name 3 times, he will show up. So it's something along those lines. So as you see in this picture, there's some offerings that are being given to Wari, and that they're being given in order to propitiate him, to pay him off, to make it so that he doesn't create some kind of disaster in the mines that might take their lives or livelihoods. So what you see here on his lap, the green, and also in his mouth, are coca leaves. He likes to chew on coca. In his right hand is a plastic bottle, and that would typically contain some homebrew alcohol. And then finally, even though he doesn't have tobacco at the moment, you see his mouth and his nose are blackened, and that might be from cigars that are, there's a little entry in his mouth, and the cigar is put there and lit. So Wari is thought of as liking alcohol, tobacco, and coca leaves. He likes to party, in other words. So if he's paid off at the Chaya, which is a ceremony usually performed on Fridays, then the miners are going to be safe. So this was from a very interesting ethnography called We Eat the Mines and the Mines Eat Us by June Nash, which makes the broader point that the way that the miners describe Wari and his character and so forth is very much like a corporate executive, especially to a United States mining company, and that this whole belief system is also intertwined with a critique of capitalism. But you can read the book if you're interested in that aspect. What is interesting here is that there is a tradition, kind of a sexist tradition, if you will, that women are not supposed to go down into the mines. Well, June Nash, who is female, did convince the miners to let her go down. Afterwards, there was some kind of minor incident. I don't think deaths, but there were a few injuries. And the miners had to perform extra chaya ceremonies because they felt that maybe the gringa, white female anthropologist might have caused some of that by going into the mine shaft. So that's one of the things that might happen when you're an anthropologist doing field work. You have to anticipate these types of things. All right, so this is an example of substances being used in ritual. As I mentioned, this is Amanita muscaria, otherwise known as fly agaric. And it's a mushroom found in North Asia to Central Asia. Some people say it might have had some influence in Europe at one point, but it's rare there. And typically it's ingested by shamans, directly or indirectly. Now, how it's ingested indirectly is kind of interesting. Somehow they realized that, or they made the observation that reindeer also take the shaman and they go wandering around in the forest. So it turns out that you can get a slightly weaker dose by drinking the urine of the reindeer, which still has some of the effects of the mushroom. In my live class, somebody brought up the question of whether any of this relates to Christmas. That is, in the American Christmas mythology, we have Rudolph the red-nosed reindeers, who leads a team of flying reindeers. Does this have anything to do with the belief that, perhaps the reindeers get high off of the Amanita and are believed to fly? This is possible. It's not really documented, but it's kind of an interesting correspondence if you're one who likes to speculate. So the third bullet point here, the mushroom aids shamans in achieving spirit flight. So they do believe that shamans can leave their physical body and fly to other locations, or sometimes their physical being can be in two places at once. But the main job as a shaman, as you'll learn when you get to the chapter on religious specialists, the main job of the shaman is healing, spiritual healing or spirit healing. So shamans enter the world of the spirits in order to get their aid in healing and to combat the malicious, bad spirits that might be causing disease. And it is believed that the shamans are aided by that. And finally, of course, some of you, when you saw this mushroom, might have recognized it. If you play video games, this is the mushroom you'll find in Mario Brothers. So next time you're playing Mario Kart or something like that, you can remember that these are hallucinogenic mushrooms and wonder why the makers of Mario decided to put them in. That's up to you. That can be your own speculation. And then finally here, I have taken one of the charts from the textbook, table 5.3, found on page 120. I've made a few adjustments to it. As a matter of fact, I created my own chart before I ever saw this textbook. And so this was based on an article that apparently the authors of this textbook also saw. And in this article, the authors refer to the French poet Baudelaire, who called drugs artificial paradises. So we take drugs, we go into this paradise, but it is temporary, it is artificial. And so we've designated here kind of a very subjective, this is not something that would be used by law enforcement or, or psychology or people who are doing clinical trials and so forth. This is a little more poetic, a little more subjective look at the effects of these drugs for religious purposes. So as you see, we have 5 categories. And at this point, I'm not going to go into very long explanations of each one of these. I'll just refer back to a few things I've said, and then maybe add a few other things. So our first category, which we call euphoria, which includes sedatives. Now, you might not think of coca or cocaine as sedatives, but actually they are. And so according to our schema of artificial paradises, we have here the effect of well-being or euphoria. Just like here, we're just repeating the classification. Now, how is coca used to achieve an altered state of consciousness? Well, it usually accompanies ritual. Like I said, with the chaya ceremony, well, in that case, they're not using the coca to achieve an altered state of consciousness directly. But in other cases in the high Andes, when priests or others are doing rituals, they'll use coca as kind of way of keeping kind of a calm, even-keeled mind as they're doing it. Cocaine is not used for religious purposes at all, not as far as I know, unless there's some new church that has arisen. Okay, our second category is Fantastica. And this is definitely the largest, most important category when we're talking about drugs used for religious purposes. So these are the hallucinogens. They cause hallucinations, they cause visions. They include stronger versions like peyote. And here, I want to very briefly refer to the film that I have assigned called Touching the Timeless. And in that film, you'll see a group from central Mexico, a group called the Huichol. That's Huichol. Go on a pilgrimage led by their shaman. And they're going to their sacred place, a place they call Wirikuta, to collect the peyote, which is a cactus that is usually about flush with the ground. It's not a cactus that grows very much out of the ground. So they collect it and they ingest it and they have visions. And they connect with their mythology. They get to connect with their sense that they're at the beginning of time, at the beginning of the universe. So peyote is an important hallucinogen, a cactus. Mushrooms, a fungi you've heard of, and I talked about the Amanita muscaria. And finally, ayahuasca. That is a vine found largely in South America that it can also produce visions. So whether a cactus, a fungus, or a vine, it grows on trees, hallucinogens come in many forms. We can even talk about the famous bufo frog that has a little bit of hallucinogen on its back. So occasionally animals have it. In a weaker form, we have hashish and marijuana. And actually, hashish is basically the tops of the marijuana or related plants. And what all of these have in common, well, and LSD, but that's not going to be directly for religious use. What they all have in common is producing the inspired imagination. They open up pathways in our brain that lead to more of a universalistic broader connectivity between different parts of our brain. And they produce hallucinations, visual effects, bright colors, and so forth. As far as one more thing on religious use, and I may, if I have time later in the semester, get a little more into that, and that's the Rastafarians of Jamaica, who are known for their musical style, reggae music. The most famous Rastafarian reggae performer being Bob Marley. They use marijuana to perform rituals they call reasoning, where they connect to their notion of Godhead, Jah Rastafari. So marijuana is used to achieve an altered state of consciousness in religious ceremonies as well. Our third category, inebriantia, think inebriated, are intoxicants. And this would include alcohol or things like either, and produce the artificial paradise of, unsurprisingly, drunkenness, and have the effect of intoxication. Now, I mentioned alcohol in terms of pouring out alcohol, so not ingesting it. And in actual fact, alcohol by itself is rarely used to achieve a religious altered state of consciousness. It might be a component when used with other things. And the reason is that the effect of alcohol, contrary to Fantastica, contrary to the hallucinogens that open the brain up to more universal connections, alcohol centers our mind a little more in our ego, if just used by itself. So this is the effect. If one gets drunk, one starts thinking about self, basically. But in combination with ritual, with other preparations, with other things, alcohol has been used. So, for example, in the Maya world, in what is called the Lacandon rainforest, you have a group called the Lacandon Maya, and they brew a beer. However, we have to say this beer is made from a bark that also has slightly hallucinogenic qualities, but it also gets them drunk. So they brew a beer in these clay pots that have the faces of their gods on it. It's a ritual called the balche, and the alcohol is called the balche, Balche, the accent mark. When they are ingesting the balche, after it's been brewed in the pots in their ceremony, they start having visions and getting drunk and getting sick and vomiting, and the faces on the clay pots start coming alive and start communicating with them. Okay, so there's an example of alcohol used to achieve an altered state of consciousness, but here kind of mixed with a slight hallucinogen, kind of bump up that effect. Our fourth category is hypnotica. These are sedatives, again, just like in euphoria, but of a slightly different kind. So for religious use, we have opium, which is famous in East Asia. Monks would smoke opium in the Taoist tradition and the Buddhist tradition. As a matter of fact, going back, the monks would also smoke marijuana. Although not directly, they put it in incense burners and be in an enclosed space. But for opium, I believe they did smoke it directly. And so opium puts one in the artificial paradise of a dreaming sleep. So the people who are taking the opium would get into a dreaming sleep and have visions that would have some kind of religious message to it. So opium has the effect of narcosis. It's a narcotic. As far as I know, heroin and barbiturates are not used for religious purposes. And finally, we come back to coffee. I'm going to take a sip here. This particular coffee is Sumatra, from Sumatra. Anyway, so excitania. These are stimulants: coffee, tea, betel, and tobacco. And they produce the artificial paradise of energetic wakefulness. And they are stimulants, so they cause stimulation. So how is coffee used for a religious state of altered state of consciousness? More ritualistically. Coffee and tea, we could see as more accompanying rituals. They and producing an effect of wakefulness, so one can focus a little more on the ritual action. So it's pretty slight. Coffee and tea are more about the social or the ritualistic aspect of religion. So think about after a religious service or at a wake, a religious wake, coffee and tea being served as a way to kind of lubricate the social interactions. Social interaction is very important in religious communities. It's one way to keep people bound together. Betel, some of you might not have heard of betel or betel. It's a nut. You'll find it in tropical Asia and the Pacific. You'll find it in India, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, in the Trobriand Islands. And our textbook does talk about the Trobriand Islands, and you'll see in a week or so there'll be a film, Trobriand cricket. So you'll be seeing a little more about Trobriand Islands. And in the film Trobriand cricket, the Trobriand Islanders play their own version of the British game cricket. And one of the things they do at the end is exchange gifts, and those might be yams, and it could be betel nut. Okay, so it is used in exchange. But so the effect of betel is kind of like tobacco. It has kind of this nicotine-like effect. So rather than, so it's like chewing tobacco, but in a nut form. And tobacco itself is sometimes used or has been observed to be used in some North American Native American ceremonies, where here we're talking about a lot of fresh tobacco being smoked all at once, which would probably just make most of us nauseous. But for a practiced ritualist, it can, along with chanting and dancing and so forth, kick them into an altered state of consciousness. But overall, the last group, excitania, is really more about ritual and perhaps just a very slight altered state of consciousness. Category 2, Fantastica, the most intense. Category 5, Excitania, the least intense. So here is our tour of artificial paradises, elaborating a little bit on the chart in the textbook. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And that's it for our lecture on altered state of consciousness. I would also, again, like to emphasize that I have assigned that film, Touching the Timeless, so go ahead and watch that as an accompaniment to this particular slideshow. Next time, we will be talking about religious leaders, religious specialists, and we'll be focusing on the shaman. So you'll be hearing more about the shaman, and so we'll bring a little bit up about altered states of consciousness, but mainly we'll be looking at other aspects of the shamanism, including modern day shamanism, neo-shamanism, which is a little controversial. Taking drugs for religious purposes, also controversial. So I want to close this out by mentioning something that is happening recently. I attended a Zoom session. And this is basically on Meetup, a Meetup group. And they were talking about the mushroom psilocybin, which in Oregon and perhaps some other places are going through clinical trials as a medication. So the psilocybin mushroom. So we're talking about using shrooms for medical purposes. And this will be done not by taking full doses, but small doses called microdoses. So they ground up the mushrooms, put them in little capsules, and one does not have the hallucinations, but they're checking to see if it has some effect on some mental conditions, mental illness conditions, such as depression and anxiety and ADHD and so forth. So that's an interesting line of research, going from a substance that was illegal and illicit to maybe something that will be our next generation of medical treatments. So we're in a vastly changing world. But here again, we can say this is one more gift that cultures around the world, smaller cultures, different cultures have given to modern society. And that's the effect of these substances that might be used as drugs, might be used for altered states of consciousness, or for both. And the more we get this into our modern society, I think the better, because we are dealing with all kinds of issues, mental health issues, and it's almost a crisis. So, look out for this. Check out what's happening in the news and keep up with it. And we'll see what happens in the world of Western medicine if we, as has been happening with such practices as acupuncture, and some other alternative medicines, integrating Western and non-Western medicines. All right, well, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you online.